So where was it that we left off on this diorama? That's right. We had just finished construction and we're getting ready to move on now to the textures and the final painting that will bring all this together to what you see here. So if you're interested in the conclusion of this two-part series, well, you've come to the right place because we're about to start some texturing and some painting. So sit back and relax, or heck, go grab some tools and materials and craft along to complete this Imperial Rust diorama. Hey everyone, I'm Desi and you're watching Crafted by Metamorphic Customs. This is part 2 of the Imperial entrance in what I like to call Imperial Rust diorama. I hope you guys caught the first video, which was mainly construction, as this video will be painting. I'll go ahead and link the first video up on the top right hand corner just in case you want to check that one out and haven't done so yet. But what I'm going to do here first is apply the texture. This texture will serve not only as a base coat to provide, well, texture, but also to provide some color. So I'm using tile grout mixed in with Mod Podge, and it's about a 1-to-1 mixture. I'm going to carefully apply it with a very small sculpting tool around all these areas which are difficult to get around. That's why I'm doing this first. Get the hard part out of the way, then I can do the major blank sections of the wall, which will be much easier to apply with a larger tool. But again, I'm using tile grout, which is a sanded tile grout mixed with Mod Podge, and it's about a 1-to-1 mix. Now, could you use tile grout and just water? I don't recommend it. It might apply just fine, but it will have adhesion issues later, and it will be very fragile. Okay, could you use tile grout and then watered down Mod Podge? Yeah, you can. You could use watered down Mod Podge to create this tile grout paste mixture, but I like to use full strength Mod Podge. Yes, that is more expensive, but it ensures that the tile grout will not crack if I ever have to ship this out, or if I ever have to move. This is more for a personal project, but if I ever have to move anywhere, this won't crack in the middle of moving. It's actually fairly sturdy and reliable. You can hit it with your hand, you can drop it, it probably won't crack. That's how good Mod Podge is. Whereas if you used water, it'll crack just looking at it wrong. So that is why I use a Mod Podge mixture. And again, I'm getting into all the hard to get little crevices, nooks and crannies first with this small sculpting tool, and I'm just applying it. And that way I can come back later and apply the rest of this same exact texture as I'm doing right now with a significantly larger tool. Now you can use any size tool, any kind of tool. You can use a plastic butter knife. It doesn't matter, just as long as you get this this texture down. And again, because it is mixed with Mod Podge, which is an adhesive, it's a glue, it'll glue and adhere very nicely to the XPS foam backing. And I'm going to put this tile grout texture mix all over. It's pretty much like frosting a cake. The only place I'm not going to put this, at least not yet, is on the ground, the bottom, the foreground area, because that will be sand. I might put a little bit of this tile grout in that area just to build up some little hills and mounds, but for now I'm going to leave it just bare. I'm also being very careful not to fill in the holes I've made for the antennas or anything else that might later go in, might later be built into the diorama. That's very important. I don't want to cover those up. And this is the fun part of this, applying this texture to a blank large wall. It's very therapeutic, at least for me. It takes no brain power here. You're just literally laying this down. And I'm purposefully going back and making it look textured. I'm even using my hands in some cases to get in some of these grooves where the wall has been carved out. Sometimes it's just easier to use your hands. And once this is dry, the next step will be to create a mixture of 1:1:1 Mod Podge water and an off-white, almost cream paint. This will have two purposes. One, the Mod Podge will seal this tile grout in. You don't really need this. I like to go that extra step, make sure it's sealed. It'll create an extra protective barrier. And the other purpose, beyond sealing it, is the white paint in this mixture will lighten that wall color. I don't want it to be this dark of a gray. This is basically a gray cement look, which is fine. You could go with this, but as long as I'm going to seal it, I might as well add in some of this white or off-white colored paint into that mixture, and just apply it with a 2-inch brush here, or 1.5-inch brush. No big deal. Just get this wherever the tile grout mixture was applied, and it'll dry very nicely and also serve as a protective barrier. And this coating won't look nearly as white as it does now on camera once it's dried. It is mainly transparent and it'll dry as such. It'll make it lighter because there is white paint in that mixture, but you gotta remember it's also mixed with Mod Podge, which is clear, and water. It's a 1:1:1 mixture. So when it's dry, it should look a little like this. Perfect color. Which takes me to the next step, which is getting some Vallejo red, putting in an airbrush, and painting some stripes on that back wall. Why red stripes? That's a good question. I don't know. I just figured I'd give it some nice color and it will look pretty cool. I've taped out the double stripes. It's going to have a thin stripe and then a fatter or wider stripe at the bottom. I've taped them out with typical blue painter's tape that you can get at any hardware store, as well as regular masking tape in between the two there. And I'm applying that red Vallejo color, which is red Vallejo model color. It is literally, that's the name of the color, it's just red. And I'm doing that again with an airbrush, and I'm going to do that in all 3 sections. I've obviously, when I applied the painter's tape, I measured it out so that the lines would connect across all 3 sections when the sections are placed next to each other. And once I'm done with the red, but before I take off the tape, I'm going to use some Sand Dune, which is a color by Delta Ceram. It's a cheap hobby paint. And I'm going to use an old piece of sponge or foam, very small. I'm going to dip it in that Sand Dune color, and I'm going to just press it on, dab it on over the red to make it look like the red is actually weathered and maybe faded through in some areas or chipping off the wall. And I'm going to do this in all 3 sections of this diorama. Once I feel that's done, now comes the moment of truth, removing the tape. And we got a nice clean line there, which is pretty good. And this has got to be everyone's favorite part when they're painting something, because just knowing that everything came out fine and that the paint didn't bleed through the tape is always a nice feeling. So, good stuff. And now for some shading with some FW Inks Sepia. And I do this in almost every diorama. I love this stuff. Maybe I use it a little too much, but hey, it gives a nice effect. And I'm just using the FW Inks in my airbrush. This is just completely undiluted in the airbrush, and I'm using this just to give it some shade, shadows, tones, and the crevices or wherever. Just it makes it look dirty, grimy, and weathered. And I'm only using one color here, sepia. I love this stuff. But you would know that because I always mention it in almost every video. And again, of course, we're going to do this on all the sections of this diorama so that it could be tied together, because this is one large diorama. I'm also going to add that same sepia color to the door. This will tie everything together. If there's brown sepia colored grime on the wall, why wouldn't it be on the door, right? So this will again tie everything together. I'm also going to use the brush now. I'm going to use that same sepia FW ink, but I'm going to dilute it 1-to-1 with water. So it's going to be a really watered down mixture of this FW ink. And I'm going to use a brush, as you see me doing here, to apply grimy streaks, or just, rainwater streaks, whatever, at random parts of the wall. Usually I'll start at where there's a component connected to the wall, like where the pipes are connected, or where the post of the antenna will eventually end up. So maybe that grime is rainwater, or the rust that will eventually be on these pipes. The water has run across the rust and is now coming down the walls. I'll also apply some of that watered down ink to the AC component and just use my airbrush to blow air on it, just air, and that'll move around that watered down ink, creating natural patterns of the ink just running across the wall or across the AC component that you just saw me do. And again, I'm just using the brush to create these streaks at random parts on the wall. Again, all about weathering and adding character, making it look lived in, dirty, uncared for. But actually, it takes a lot of care to make it look uncared for, which is quite humorous. But this is fun. I love this stuff. Painting has to be one of my favorite parts of any diorama. And once we have enough grimy streaks, we're gonna put some more grime, this time using Citadel brand Typhus Corrosion. Yes, that is the name of the paint, Typhus Corrosion. Citadel is an awesome line of paints, mainly for Warhammer models, because it's by Games Workshop, who also makes the Warhammer line of models for their miniature tabletop game. I love the line, love the lore of that, but more on that later, and probably in the next video, which will hopefully be focused on Warhammer, believe it or not. But for now, let's focus on this. Again, I'm using Typhus Corrosion and a brush, and I'm just applying this paint to the crevices where the pipes connect to each other in just random places. Typhus Corrosion is a very, very dark brown, almost black paint that has a sandy texture to it. It is essentially another form, another way of adding grime. It dries very matte, and it is great for this. You'll hear many model painters reference this paint. Specifically, again, it's called Typhus Corrosion. It is awesome. Kind of expensive. I think it's about $5 a bottle. You saw how small that bottle was, right? But it is awesome. And now it's time to finally glue on the additional components, and I'm speaking about the antennas. I'm going to use some hot glue in these post holes I've created. Fit this in, just push in as far as I can there, and then I'm going to make sure it's lined up straight. Yep. I'm also going to glue in the heater component. I'm going to use hot glue at the top there. I'm sorry, super glue, not hot glue, but I used hot glue at the bottom. And some hot glue again to connect the post of this antenna. Again, I just used 2 antennas. And now for some rust. I'm using some old rust and some dark brown pigments from Vallejo Pigments, and I'm gonna mix both of those pigments, which are 1:1, with Liquitex Airbrush Medium. I've never mixed pigments with Airbrush Medium, but since the Airbrush Medium is essentially a binder, I figured I'd try it, and it worked great. There's different mediums you can use to adhere pigments. This one was great. I had it on hand, obviously, because I use an airbrush, and it works great as a pigment binder. So you mix the pigment 1:1 with this airbrush medium, and then just brush it on. It creates like a paste when you mix it 1:1. So you brush on this paste, this rust brown colored paste, wherever I would have previously put the Typhus Corrosion, which Typhus Corrosion, again, had a little bit of sand in it, gives it a nice texture. Then I come back with this pigment, this mixed pigment paste, and apply that over the Typhus Corrosion, giving me even more texture, but this time it's that bright reddish brown color. Great way to create rust. Start off with Typhus Corrosion, then use some actual pigments over to Typhus Corrosion. It'll give you a great color if you use, whatever rust color you want to use. Obviously, I'm using an old rust mixed with a dark brown pigment, creating this reddish rust color. And that's about it. Just those 2 things mixed together or layered on top of each other are great. I'm also adding this to the door. I did add Typhus Corrosion to the door, and I'm adding this pigment mixture on top of the Typhus Corrosion, and again, a very compelling rust effect. And on to the next part, which is the tarp, or the piece of cloth that's going to hang on the left section of this diorama. I'm using a red piece of cloth. I wish I could tell you what type of cloth it was. It's probably just cotton. And I can't tell you what it is because I didn't go to the store to get this. I just asked my wife if she had any spare fabrics lying around, and she did. Specifically, I was looking for red, she had a piece, and I said, sure. Which illustrates the importance of using found materials sometimes when building dioramas. So what I'm doing here is I've measured out this piece of fabric, I've cut it out, and I'm burning the edges just to give it some, again, all about weathering, so giving it some characters, maybe burn a hole there in the middle. I'm using my torch here. Please be careful and don't play with fire. But yeah, that's what I did. I'm also using a sanding sponge to sand down and, again, weather and create scratches on this fabric to make it look really old and worn. Then what I'm going to do, remember that paint mixture I used to seal the wall? Well, I added some gray paint to it and I mixed it in. Now that mixture, again, it was Mod Podge, water, and white paint, and now I added black paint to it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to dip this bright red cloth in this watered down Mod Podge gray paint. This will obviously harden this, right? But it'll also add as a glue agent to glue it to the wooden dowels. And it'll harden it, it'll make it essentially retain that cloth texture, but make it stiff enough that it doesn't move around and it still has that weight. It's gonna look real, because right now it's kind of soaked in this glue mixture, so it's gonna hang down with a real weight, and when it dries, it's gonna dry in that shape, so it's gonna end up looking real. Now, I should have worn gloves here, but I ran out of them, so it is what it is. It's easy to wash off your hands afterwards, but I'm just sliding it over the wooden dowels. It seems really gray here. It looks like you've lost all the red, but it won't dry that gray. It'll actually be like a very, or will actually look like a very dirty red color, which is exactly what I'm going for. I want it to look old and worn and extremely dirty. Now, you'll also notice I used clearly saran wrap to protect the diorama since it's already fully painted, and I didn't want to get any of that gray paint on the background. I'm also going to go ahead and hot glue the greeting droid into the wall, into that hole I created. And lastly, I put some pieces of random plastic bits I have around. I put them into the texture of the wall before the texture dried, and I'm going to use those plastic pieces to essentially feed this wire. By the way, by wire I mean rubber beading material from Hobby Lobby. At this scale, it looks like black wiring. So I'm going to feed those wires, if you will, through the plastic bits, and it'll look like random hanging wires in the environment. It gives a nice visual cue there. And I'm using super glue. I don't really need to glue it because I made the holes into the foam and into the texture deep enough, but it doesn't hurt to super glue the bits in there. And to be clear, I'm super gluing the wires to the plastic components I added, not to the foam, because that will melt the foam. And that brings us to the final part. I've gone ahead and painted the foreground here in a light tan or a light beige color, and then I've wrapped the background in saran wrap to protect it during this next part. And I've also created a mixture of 1-to-1 tile grout and play sand from the hardware store, and I'll use this old kitchen strainer as a sifter to apply the sand. At first I'll use this strainer and kind of just chuck the sand in the hard to reach corners up against the wall and behind this 3D printed heater component. And then for the rest of it, I'll just, well, sift the sand onto the ground. And you'll notice that I'm just literally applying this sand tile grout mixture onto the ground without using any adhesive. There's no glue, there's nothing yet. I'm literally just putting down sand with this strainer. Then when I'm ready, I'm going to grab a dry brush. There's no paint on this, it's about a 1/2-inch brush, and I'm just going to use this to gently dab the sand to create impressions of either footprints or maybe sand being blown by the wind. The point is, this shouldn't be a perfectly flat sand ground because it's in front of an entrance. There's got to be either foot traffic or just general disturbance of the ground. So this is what I want to do before I move on to the next step, which is using a 1-to-1 mix of water and alcohol in a spray bottle. I'm going to use that spray bottle and I'm going to spray the ground to dampen the sand. This water and alcohol mixture will allow the next step, which is the adhesive, to properly coat the ground and stick the sand in place. And for the adhesive, I'm using a 1-to-1 mixture of water and Mod Podge. I'm going to use this little dripper bottle, and I'm just going to pour the Mod Podge and water mixture all over the sand. I'm going to be very liberal here, and I'm just going to throw on as much as I possibly can. You're going to need a lot of this so that the sand really adheres to the ground, stays in place, and keeps that sand texture. We're going for realism here. So this is important. Then after I applied the mixture of the Mod Podge, which is an adhesive, in the water, I then come back with the same water and alcohol spray bottle and I just give it one gentle spray over it. I'll do the exact same thing on the other 2 sections. And if you've been following along, you know this diorama was created in 3 sections. So I'm just going to do the same thing. And you don't need to use a strainer for this. You can literally just get a handful of sand and throw it on the base using your hands. It's up to you, but I like using this strainer because it creates this even texture. And then it allows me to come back with the brush like I did there, create further textures, and then just move on. And water and alcohol, pretty easy to obtain. Very important to use that water alcohol mixture first. It dampens the ground and it allows for the adhesive that I'm using now to evenly distribute. So that water and alcohol step before the glue, really important. Don't forget that. And then again, after you apply the glue, as you can see, it's on there. It looks like just a white mess, but this will dry really nicely. And after that, I'm going to come back again with a gentle mist of the water and alcohol. And that's it. All that led to this. It really, I think it turned out better than I expected. I had a vision for this in my mind, and I gotta be honest, it did look in my head like what it turned out, but I didn't see all the details being as crisp and as nice as they actually turned out in the final product. And I think a lot of it is due to the awesome 3D components I was able to source online, plus just bringing those 3D components together in this diorama and then adding the paint. The textures and the paint go a long way. They really, really do. I like the lighting elements. I've used similar lighting elements in my previous dioramas and similar doors, Imperial entrances, if you will, that I've created. I reused those here, and I think they're a nice add-on, but really they just complement the textures of the tile grout and the Mod Podge and the rust. The rust really adds this extra element, and you might notice the 3D printed components were based off an Imperial entrance scene from the first season of The Mandalorian. Now that scene is a little different. It's not as weathered, as rusted as I made this scene, but hey, this was my own interpretation of that, and I like weathering, so I had fun with it. So I hope you guys enjoyed not only looking at the final diorama and these pictures that we see here, but the entire process. This was lots of fun, as I said in the first video, and it let me create these wonderful these wonderful pictures you see here. So much fun. I hope to do another one this size in the future, and I hope you guys again enjoyed. If you did, please like, subscribe, and tell me what you thought in the comments below. That's important. Tell me what you would have done differently, why you liked it, why you disliked it, or what you hope to see in a future episode. And until then, stay crafted.